What's up, guys? Welcome back to the LTL Podcast. I am here with Steve,
Oh, well.
as always, and our rundown of teams that are clinching continues today. As of recording this, it is April 20th at around 7:20 p.m. So a couple more teams have clinched since we last saw each other, including the Pittsburgh Penguins, the Tampa Bay Lightning, the Bruins, the Capitals, the Minnesota Wild, St. Louis Blues, and Calgary Flames. So the East is set. All 8 teams in the East have clinched. It is just a matter of positioning. As of this moment in time, the Hurricanes and the Rangers look pretty much locked into either spots 1 or 2. They are both tied with 106 points. The Carolina Hurricanes holding the regulation or overtime win tiebreaker with 48. And it's going to be between the Penguins and Capitals for that third spot in the Metro. Currently, the Capitals are 1 point back, but hold a game in hand. The Tampa Bay Lightning are 1 point ahead of the Boston Bruins for the third spot in the Atlantic. And the Leafs and Florida Panthers look not clinched into those top 2 spots, but they are pretty well ahead. I think it's mathematically impossible at this point for the Florida Panthers to get any lower than second place. So the Florida Panthers have clinched a top 2 spot and home ice advantage, and the Tampa Bay Lightning are still trailing the Leafs by 8 points. So the Leafs look pretty locked in that second spot. As far as who ends up in a wild card between the Penguins, Lightning, Bruins, and Capitals, that remains to be seen. And in the West, the St. Louis Blues and Minnesota Wild both clinched with 103 points. The Calgary Flames clinched the Pacific with 104 points. They haven't won the Pacific quite yet. However, they are looking pretty good to do that, 10 points ahead of the Edmonton Oilers. And the Colorado Avalanche have clinched the Central Division, so they will have home ice advantage in the first round. So let's start in the East. We'll talk the Pittsburgh Penguins, the seemingly perennial contender that just never wants to go away, despite how many times, myself included, have said things like, this might be the last year we talk about this team in this way. But yeah, I'll go to you first in this one. Just give me your thoughts on the Penguins and kind of where they fit into this whole tier list of playoff teams this year.
I'm gonna be real honest with you. I really don't know how they did so well this year. Like, the roster's not as solid as I thought a lot of the other teams, even teams that didn't make the playoffs. Like, I honestly thought the Islanders would have been in this position over the Pittsburgh Penguins. Um, Especially because they spent such a large part of the season without, Malkin or Crosby, right? Like, if they'd started the season with a healthy Malkin and Crosby, then I wouldn't have been surprised that they'd been fighting for a divisional spot all year. But the fact that Evan Rodriguez was their leading scorer up until January was kind of wild. So, I mean, I don't think there are very many good matchups for the Penguins here. Like, no matter where they go, how, like, wild card, division, crossing over, like, I just don't see a lot of really great matchups for them. Specifically because, like, I'm still not sold on the goaltending, and like the defense is very obviously a work in progress. Um, but I mean, hey, you never know. Like, they got there, right? And like, that's all that matters. Like, you just need to show up to the dance as long as you have Sidney Crosby on your team, because like at any point he could just will your team to victory, like he's done in the past. Um, so I was gonna stick them onto my tier list, though. I definitely think these are just like they're just like a solid playoff team. I really don't think they're gonna make a lot of noise. I don't see them as being all that dangerous, really, honestly, like in the playoffs. So, I mean, I think they're definitely firmly established as a playoff team, obviously, like clinched. But I think it's more so an indicator of like the talent level, like where they're at, right? Like, I think for the Pittsburgh Penguins, the window is closed. And while I think like the window being closed doesn't mean they won't make the playoffs, I just think their time at the top of the mountain is over, right? Like, they've won the 3 Stanley Cups with Sidney Crosby, and they've been to the 4 Stanley Cup finals with him. It's only natural that like those 10 or so years of heavy competition and being like heavily competitive with the rest of the league is going to catch up to you. I mean, it's just look at the Blackhawks. Being competitive for so long has essentially left them gutted, and it's doing the same thing here in Pittsburgh. And while I do admire like some of their attempts to get a little younger and to add a little bit more up front, like they brought in Kasperi Kapanen and things like that, I mean, there's been some attempt to try to extend the window, but I don't think they've done enough to really like address all of the holes or questions I have with the roster for me to put them any higher than just like a playoff team, you know?
Yeah, do you think that perhaps the Metropolitan having a couple teams that were not as good as we thought they would be, like specifically the Islanders having this complete, I'll use the phrase again, complete mulligan of a year essentially, uh, but not even just the Islanders, not being as competitive as they should have been. The Devils, after the big offseason acquiring Dougie Hamilton, many people thought that, yeah, they're not going to be a playoff team, but they'll kind of be in that 4 or 5 area where they'll be, maybe ending up with like 80 something points this year. They've been horrible. They are sitting down at the bottom with 61 points. And the Flyers sitting down at the bottom with 57 points are even worse than, many people outside of myself, and I know you were somewhat of a believer. I was a very big believer in this roster coming into this year. Many people had them missing the playoffs, but not many people had them being this bad. I mean, do you think that there's something to be said for a couple of teams in the Metropolitan kind of being a little bit more of a doormat than we thought that leads to this team being in this playoff spot?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think there's something to be said for that, right? The fact that certain teams were essentially free wins for large stretches of the year. Um, I mean, I think it could even be said for other teams in the Eastern Conference just in general, right? Like, yeah, I guess we'll stick to the division because, like, the fact that, like, all those points in the division ended up funneling to the top because those teams weren't as good as we thought they'd be really did kind of end up giving the Penguins a boost, right? Like, it didn't make the fact that they got swept in the season series by the Rangers like as big a deal because they were able to more or less make up the gap in points for a large part of the year by beating up on Philly or the Devils, even Columbus to a certain extent, who's been better than people thought they were, but still hasn't done a great job of keeping the points out of the hands of teams that have been competitive. They haven't played spoiler all that well. So I think there's definitely something to be said for that, and I think there's something to be said for like a dramatic overachievement on the part of the roster. You know what I mean? Like the fact that Evan Rodriguez is having a career year the way he is, and it's not even like a slight bump. You know what I mean? Where he's having like a slightly better year. Like this is a significant like career year for him. Like I think he's got like 60 something points. Might be close to 70 now. Like I don't even know, but I know at one point he was the leading scorer on the Pittsburgh Penguins, which is wild when you consider that he was like a fourth line player on the Buffalo Sabres like 2 or 3 years ago. You know, and it's not like his development path took him here. Like he started there, he developed, and he came here. It's like no, he was a nobody and then came here and then was elevated and forced into a position to have to like sink or swim, and he just happened to swim. You know, so Pittsburgh definitely has like the weaker, not a weak division, but the teams at the bottom of the division being weaker to thank, and some guys who helped them tread water a little better than they probably should have, or we thought they could have.
Yeah, I think, certainly the Metropolitan kind of stumbling a little bit, essentially when you take the Islanders out of the equation as early as the injuries, COVID, and the NHL did, it definitely opens up that avenue because not a lot of people outside of myself were really expecting anyone else in this division to compete for a playoff spot other than I thought Philly would have been at this point. I thought, we had 5 teams that could compete for a playoff spot, and then we had 3 kind of doormats in the Jackets, Devils, and my brain is exploding. Jackets, Devils, or not 3 doormats, but the Jackets and Devils were the only 2 that I was like straight up counting out of the playoff race from the beginning of the year. And it ends up being that, when you basically, the Islanders get torpedoed early by what essentially boils down to a series of incredibly unfortunate events.
Yeah, it's almost like Lemony Snicket wrote this season for you guys.
Yeah.
It's like cosmic level bad luck.
By the way, we do want to acknowledge the passing of Islander legend Mike Bossy.
Oh yeah.
Um, I think towards the end of the episode, where we're going to give that a little bit more time, we do want to acknowledge that. So don't think we forgot. We're just going to wrap the end of the episode with that up. But, the Islanders kind of having a rough year. The Devils and Flyers essentially taking themselves completely out of the equation very early on. And it's a fortunate thing for the Penguins because it kind of opens up that roster spot. Essentially, what would be a roster spot for the playoffs, right? That's not to say this team isn't decent. Obviously guys like Crosby, Gensel, Letang, Malkin. There's a reason that these guys are the names that they are, right? But to your point, when I look at a lot of the part of this team, are they as complete a team as the Hurricanes are? They're definitely not. Are they as complete a team as, and I don't even think the Rangers are a complete team. I still think that the Rangers have a little bit of work to do, but are the Rangers a more complete team than the Penguins? Absolutely. Are the Capitals a more complete team than the Penguins? That's up in the air, but I think you could make an argument. And then when you look at some of the other teams, like obviously the Bruins, the Panthers, there are more complete teams than this in the division. Even arguably the Islanders are a way more complete team than Penguins. So I think going into the playoffs, the thing that's going to be the biggest concern is obviously the goaltending, right? Not going to lie about it. There were stretches where last year in the playoffs, the Penguins absolutely probably should have won that series against the Islanders. I mean, there were large stretches where the Penguins were outplaying the Islanders pretty badly. And the difference was having Ilya Sorokin versus Tristan Jarry in net. I mean, that's really what it boiled down to. Sorokin let the Islanders kind of tread water until they found their game and then were able to take over the series late. But, Tristan Jarry, for all he's done in a regular season, hasn't really proven to me in the playoffs that I can rely on him. Now, granted, look, he's only 26. He's only really had a couple of playoff, he's had 7 total playoff games under his belt, so he's still young. But when you have as disastrous a series as he did last year, it's cause for concern. And then, he's even might miss the start of the playoffs. So then you're turning to Casey DeSmith and Louis Domingue in net because Tristan Jarry's hurt. He's week to week, so he might miss the start of the playoffs. And I'm not really sold on either one of those guys as a starting goaltender, specifically when you look at the teams that they're going to be playing against, potentially playing against either the New York Rangers or if they fall to a wild card spot, the Carolina Hurricanes or the Florida Panthers, who have incredibly potent offenses. You're going to need a goaltender to help you out. If they're playing the Islanders or, maybe a team like the Bruins, I could see you getting away with maybe just average goaltending because neither one of those teams tends to score that much. But if you're playing the Hurricanes, the Rangers, the Panthers, I mean, you can't go into that series with shaky goaltending. And I don't want to write Tristan Jarry off after only 7 games. Obviously, I'm not gonna do that. But Tristan Jarry isn't Shesterkin. He isn't Freddie Anderson, who even Freddie Anderson might miss the start of the playoffs, but he isn't Freddie Anderson. He's not Sergei Bobrovsky. He's not Andrei Vasilevsky. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I mean, even without Anderson, Carolina's got Antti Raanta, so it's like any of the teams they're playing, they have the opportunity to face pretty much have like potent offenses, like you said, but also like their goaltending outclasses the Penguins. So it's not even like the Penguins can rely on their goaltender to steal them a game if they have to. You know what I mean? Like, it just seems to me like that the roster is good enough to make the playoffs, but not really good enough to go anywhere when the rest of the teams are only getting better. You know what I mean? Like, it's like an arms race. And right now, like, the Rangers and the Hurricanes and teams like that are on, like, their upswing, and, like, the Penguins are on the downslope of the mountain. So, like, just unfortunately for them, like, time is finally catching up to them.
Yeah, I mean, out of all the teams in the playoffs, I think the only team that they might be able to kind of hang with and win a series outright against, maybe a team like Boston, maybe a team like the Capitals, and maybe a team like Toronto. But unfortunately for them, that's that matchup just isn't going to happen. They will almost certainly, at this point, play either of the Rangers, the Hurricanes, or the Panthers. Because Toronto's not overtaking Florida for the first spot in the Atlantic. And the Bruins aren't doing that, obviously. They can't mathematically do that at this point. So it's just a bad matchup in a very tough division for them. And there's just a lot of things in this roster I'm not really thrilled about. So I agree with you. I think they're a playoff team that got here on a little bit of good fortune. The roster's not bad. Don't get me wrong. I'm not here going to sit here and say that they don't deserve to be in the playoffs. They certainly do deserve to be in the playoffs. But that doesn't mean you also deserve to go anywhere once you get to the dance. So I think they're a first round out any way you kind of shake it for them this year. So the next team we'll talk about the Tampa Bay Lightning, currently sitting 46, 22, and 8 with 100 points, third in the Atlantic Division, currently trying their damnedest to fend off a charging Boston Bruins, who are 6-4 in their last 10 games, trying to get into a divisional spot to avoid playing the Panthers or the Hurricanes. The strange thing about the Lightning this year is we kind of expected the Panthers to be as good as they are. A lot of people had the Panthers pegged to win that division, but I did not expect the Lightning to be in third. I thought they were going to be in second place, and as far as why this is the case, I mean, you can kind of point to a couple of things. Maybe a little bit of a lack of depth. That fact that the Lightning the last couple of years have basically had to completely restructure their bottom six 2 years in a row because of the cap situation. Maybe a little bit of a weaker defense going on this year. Do you remember when I said last year about the Carolina Hurricanes, where I said they're a really good team, it just feels like they need to get slightly better at key positions, like turn Nino Niederreiter into a better second line center, which isn't even that big of an upgrade. Yeah. It kind of feels like the inverse is happening with the Lightning, where they're just getting slightly worse, which isn't to say that they're bad. Their depth is still good, but it's not as maybe potent as it has been in previous years. And I don't know. It feels like this team is certainly, if I had to place them, I would still consider this team a Stanley Cup contender without a doubt in my mind. The question is just going to boil down to, can this team end up playing a team like, the Hurricanes if they fall to a wildcard spot, or the Florida Panthers? That's a question. So I'm interested to hear your thoughts about the Tampa Bay Lightning this year.
I mean, the Lightning are a weird story, right? Because they're about where I expected them to be, like, in terms of being competitive, right? I didn't think that Toronto would be as good as they are and be ahead of them right now. But I do think the Lightning are pretty much right where I expected them to be. Like, they took one and a half steps back from where they had been, because like 2 years in a row, we pretty much guaranteed a Stanley Cup for these guys. Like, they were champions in all but name by the end of the regular season, Whereas this year it feels like a little more open because the Lightning don't feel as threatening. I mean, not to say that they aren't still like a big threat and a dangerous team, and teams should be scared of them coming into these playoffs, but they don't feel like as big of a threat. It's not DEFCON 1 anymore if you pull the Tampa Bay Lightning, because like you might feel like you have a shot. But I mean, I agree with you. I definitely think they're a Stanley Cup contender. Like, it's hard to bet against a team that's won the last 2 Stanley Cups, especially because a large part of that roster has remained intact. I mean, sure, their third line isn't what it was, and their depth isn't as, they're not as deep as they were, but when you've managed to keep together that top 6 and your top 4 pairing, more or less, and combined with, Andrei Vasilevsky still being arguably the best goaltender in the league, like, that's a team that's scary for anybody, Like, I think they can match up against anybody and realistically win, in the inverse of the Penguins, right? Whereas, like, the Penguins, I don't think could beat anybody unless, like you said, they match up with somebody they're punching down. Whereas I feel like the Lightning, even if they're punching up in like the standings, will have a shot at winning. Like, I think they could beat the Panthers. I think they could beat the Maple Leafs. But I don't know if they will. Like, I don't think it's a guarantee anymore.
Yeah, certainly. And to the Tampa Bay Lightning's benefit, one of the only teams that has really given them any kind of problems over the last couple of years has been the New York Islanders. The Lightning had a pretty good rampage going through the Eastern Conference, for the last two seasons up until they faced the New York Islanders. And the important part is A, the Islanders themselves aren't here, but B, there's not really an Islander-like team in this playoff run. I mean, the Bruins are the closest you'll get, but even the Bruins lately have kind of been embracing a more offensive play style to play around the fact that they're so heavily reliant on their top line. And, you know, the Islanders aren't here. The Jackets aren't here. Really, the two teams in the East that I think are built and designed to basically completely counter the style of play that the Tampa Bay Lightning bring. Uh, so they have a little bit more of a fortuitous run if they want to play that open style of hockey. And yeah, I mean, I certainly am not counting this team out by any stretch of the imagination. But to your point, I'm not handing them the Stanley Cup yet, like I was kind of the last two seasons. Um, so I certainly think they can make a deep run. It looks like they're going to end up matching up against any of the Toronto Maple Leafs, Hurricanes, or Panthers. I think the hardest team, obviously, out of those three would be the Panthers, not just because of the familiarity aspect, but because the Panthers probably have the best team to counteract the Lightning out of those three when you look at their depth and then even their top line players like Barkov and Sam Bennett, Huberdeau, like these guys that their defense is either severely underrated in the case of Barkov, or you have a pest like Sam Bennett who is not only going to get under your skin, but he's also going to put goals in the playoffs. So it's going to be harder for the Lightning than it has been in the previous couple of years, but I'm not counting them out by any stretch of the imagination. I mean, they're just too damn good to do that to them. So, yes, we'll see the Tampa Bay Lightning in these playoffs again. And speaking of the Atlantic Division, we're going to stick there with the Boston Bruins sitting with 99 points, 47, 24, and 5. Currently sitting in the first wildcard spot, like I mentioned, only 1 point behind the Tampa Bay Lightning. We'll go to you first on this one. How do you feel about the Boston Bruins this year?
Well, I think they're an interesting team because I feel dramatically better about them now than I did maybe, before the deadline. I think acquiring Hampus Lindholm really didn't fix all of the problems, but it answered a lot of the question marks I might have had about the team. I mean, it's a solid team, right? Like the only reason they're in the wild card is by nature of the fact that their division is also really good. So it's funny to think that one of the best teams in the league is going to end up being a quote unquote wild card. But I don't know if I feel as confident this year as I did last year about the Bruins. And I know we keep saying it, when is it finally going to end for the Boston Bruins? And I'm not saying this year is the year, but I think this is probably going to be one of the last couple of years where the Bruins actually are still highly competitive, where we can still think of them as the Boston Bruins. That being said, I don't love a lot of these matchups for them in the first round, right? If they stay in the wild card and they pull either Florida or Carolina, that's rough. I don't think they match up particularly well against either team, So for me, I guess I'd rank them as a bubble Stanley Cup contender, right? The team that has the talent to do it, but I don't really think they will. I'm not banking on them doing it.
I have an interesting kind of a theory crafting question for you here. Do you watched the playoff series with the Bruins and the Lightning in the bubble, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then did you watch a lot of the playoff series between the Bruins and the Islanders last year?
I watched most of it, yeah.
So I have an interesting question in terms of the goaltending, right? Because this year, obviously, no Tuukka Rask. They're coming in with Linus Ullmark. Tuukka Rask obviously also left the bubble a little bit earlier than expected in 2019 or 2020 Do you think that there's something to be said for maybe the Bruins having been overly reliant on Tuukka Rask and playing, even though the Bruins have always had good defense, playing a little bit looser than they normally would because they thought Rask could make the big saves and do what he had to do, even though he was showing his age. And then this year we might see a tighter, more return to quote-unquote Bruins hockey now that they're going in with Linus Ullmark, who has never played in a playoff game.
I don't know. I don't know if it's necessarily like their belief in Rast made them play a little more open and just that like that's the style the team's more trying to embrace with their younger players. I mean, I don't think they're going to be like because let's be honest, like the Islanders are more or less built in the image of that 2011 Bruins team, right? Like a really defensive team that like is big and tough, has its stars, can score opportune goals, but more or less is just looking to ground and pound you until you win. And I don't think that like the Boston Bruins necessarily are built like that anymore. Like I don't think the roster can support that kind of play style. So I don't know if they'd be able to revert to something like that. I mean, with Linus Ullmark being in net, I definitely do think like they'll probably try to protect him a little more than they would if they had Tuukka Rask. But I definitely don't think it's going to be something noticeable. I don't think it's going to be like them sacrificing offense just in order to play defense for Linus. Like I think Linus Ullmark has proven himself this year that like he is a legitimate number one, and I think the Bruins are probably going to go into this feeling like they don't have to do that. You know, they don't have to shelter him as much as they might have if maybe he had a little bit more of a rough year transitioning to the number one role. So I don't know. I guess it really depends on who's healthy, right? Because I don't know if David Pastrnak is back yet. I know Bergeron's back, but you know, depending on who the Bruins have, I guess it's really going to dictate how they play. Because if any of that top line is out, I think they're going to have to slow down their game dramatically.
I'm just noticing here that Nick Foligno is having an awful year for the Bruins. Jesus.
Oh yeah, terrible.
Just 2 goals, 11 assists, 13 points in 58 games. My God. And speaking on that same kind of train of thought, I do agree with you. I think it would be kind of silly for them to try to force this roster to play a way that it's not built to play anymore. But talking about guys like Nick Foligno severely underperforming, even a guy like Brendan Carlo, who is still young, he's only 25, but he's kind of had, he was expected to take a big step this year. He's only got 15 points in 73 games. His defense is good, so that obviously that's all they really care about. But the depth, this is the big thing that's going to kill the Bruins for me, I think, this year, is the depth problem, right? Obviously, everyone knows about the first line, Marchand, Bergeron, Pastrnak. Everyone knows that. Taylor Hall's having a pretty good year, 56 points. Coyle, 42 points on the second line center. Not bad. Howla, 40 points. Jake DeBrusk, 38 points, 23 goals. But the depth doesn't really sustain a lot of itself down the roster, in my opinion, for this Boston Bruins team. And, as difficult as it is to do, if you can contain that first line, you'll stand a pretty good shot at winning this series against the Boston Bruins. You still got to watch out for Taylor Hall. Only 17 goals, which is probably less than the Bruins would want him to be at. I think they're probably looking more in the 25 to 30 goal range out of him, especially considering he had 8 goals in 16 games last year for them. But, if you can stop that first line, you stand a pretty good chance of winning. And unfortunately, like you said, for the Bruins, the depth matchup for them just isn't going to be there. I mean, the depth of the Carolina Hurricanes is significantly better than theirs. Even the depth for the New York Rangers, who made a concentrated effort to get better in the depth this year, is better than the Boston Bruins if the Rangers take over that first spot in the Metro. The depth for the Florida Panthers, I probably don't even need to talk about that. If they get into that second spot or the third spot and play the Leafs, okay, you can probably match your depth, player for player against the Toronto Maple Leafs. But outside of the Leafs, the Penguins, and the Capitals, I'm not feeling great about the Bruins matchup against any of these other teams. And there's almost no possible chance they could play the Capitals or the Penguins at this point. I mathematically, I think it's actually impossible for them to play any of those teams. Or not mathematically yet, but it's going to be quite soon. So I don't know. I feel like if the Bruins really want to get their best chance at a playoff run, they need to get into third place. They need to play the Leafs in the first round, get hot at the right time, and then make a run after that. But it's the depth, man. And that's the thing that we've noticed. Teams have been taking notes over the last couple of years. The Lightning in 2019 got embarrassed by the Columbus Blue Jackets, and they said, all right, we've got to get meaner, we've got to get nastier, and we've got to get deeper. They did that, and they won 2 Stanley Cups. Rangers for the past 2 seasons have missed the playoffs when they had really good teams, and they said, all right, we've got to get bigger, we've got to get meaner, we've got to get deeper. And they've done that, and they're in a really good spot now. And it feels like the Bruins' depth is taking the reverse of that, where it's getting weaker and weaker and weaker, and it's harder to win a cup with a team like that now than it was 10 years ago, or even not even 10 years ago, because the Kings were one of the deepest teams in the league in 2012, winning Stanley Cups. You can't do it with a one-trick pony anymore. Do you have something to add to that?
Not really. I would agree with you. I don't think the Bruins are necessarily in the same place they might have been even, say, last year, where I think they were like in a strong position to compete.
Yeah, certainly. And, again, I think I agree with you that the Hampus Lindholm trade was phenomenal. It can maybe help shelter Linus Ullmark a little bit more in the playoffs, but if you can manage to bottle up that first line, and again, it's not easy to do, but, if they play like the Panthers, Barkov can go center for center with Patrice Bergeron and kind of bottle him up. And then you got Ekblad and all these other guys on the wings to worry about. So, the same with the Carolina Hurricanes. They have 3 centers, and, between all their 3 centers, you can match up a guy like Jordan Staal, and he's probably going to do his pretty good job at bottling up a guy like Patrice Bergeron, and then Jacob Slavin can do a pretty good job bottling up Marchand. And the question is, well, where do we go from here? A second line of Taylor Hall, yes. Charlie Coyle and Eric Howell is not the most threatening thing on the planet. So, yeah, I don't know. I don't think it's happening for the Bruins this year. I think they're, unless they get into that third spot, I think they have a pretty good shot at the Leafs, if nothing else, because the Leafs are a huge glass cannon. But other than that, I think... God, these hiccups are killing me. I think that the Bruins are looking like they're on the trend of a first-round exit this year. So finally, the last team in the East, before we head over to the couple of teams in the West, you have the Washington Capitals, who are currently sitting at 43-23-10, 96 points. And oddly enough, this team has been very good on the road this year. They're 19-15-5 at home, so 19-20 at home. But 24-8-5 on the road, 24-13 on the road. So maybe being a wild card is actually beneficial to these guys.
Road warriors, I guess. Yeah.
They're making a huge run at the Pittsburgh Penguins right now. The Penguins are 3-6-1 in their last 10. The Capitals are 7-3. Washington trying their damnedest to get into that third spot in the Metro. I'll start with this one. Feel pretty similar with this team as I do about the Penguins, to be quite honest with you. I see these two teams as being in very, very similar spots, Pretty good offenses, okay defenses, and then I won't say bad goaltending, because I actually do think Samsonov and Vanacek are solid goaltenders, but question marks when it comes to playoff performance, because Tristan Jarry in the regular season is fine. He's a pretty good goalie actually in the regular season. It's when you get to the playoffs that the question marks start. And the Capitals are going into the playoffs with Vanacek and Samsonov, who between the two of them have a grand total of 4 playoff games. So that's the big question for me. Do I believe in either one of these guys in the playoffs? I think based on what I've seen, I can feel okay about it, but I'm not going to say it's good enough given the rest of the roster being as questionable, specifically the defense of the Capitals. I mean, John Carlson's pretty good. Dmitry Orlov, Justin Schultz, Trevor Van Riemsdyk, Nick Jensen, Matt Irwin, and Michael Kempney, kind of the other guys bringing up the other part of that. But I can't really say that I'm all that bought into that defense, if I'm being honest with you. And when you combine that with the lack of really a shutdown kind of center. I mean, Nick Backstrom's defense is pretty good. Lars Eller's defense is okay. Kuznetsov defense is almost non-existent. But they just don't have that matchup type center. So when you combine all these defensive holes in the roster, not really a matchup type center. Defense is kind of questionable outside of John Carlson in terms of elite talent. And two goalies that have 4 goal games played in the playoffs between them, I'm not really seeing a lot of great matchups for this Capitals team either. So how do you feel about these guys going into the playoffs?
I'm in the same boat as you, I think. I mean, it only makes sense that they're in the same boat as the Penguins, right? Considering like both these teams were like highly competitive at like pretty much exactly the same time. So, I think their forward group is probably a little better than the Pittsburgh Penguins. They might be able to do a little more damage with that forward core, but yeah, I don't know. I don't think they're as deep as they've been or as dangerous as they've been. I mean, they traded for Anthony Mantha, and he really hasn't lived up to a lot of the expectations that people had for him when he came over. Yeah, the defense is pretty patchy, and like you said, when you combine that with two goaltenders who are solid but are untested, it's kind of, the perfect storm of just question marks. Like the perfect storm of like, really no, for me to say like, for me to be able to say like, oh yeah, no, this is like a good team. Like not to say they aren't a good team, but like this is like a really good team. Like this is a team that could win a Stanley Cup. Now again, we've said it before, and I'll say it again. Like once you get to the Stanley Cup playoffs, like anything can happen. Like you could get red hot and go all the way, but barring some kind of like cosmic intervention or like some kind of Cinderella run, I really don't see the Washington Capitals really going all that far. Like you said, like I don't see there being a ton of good matchups for them, even if they manage to get into the divisional spot and they play either the Rangers or the Carolina Hurricanes. I don't think those are really matchups they should want. Um, and if they stay in the wild card, again, either the Rangers or Carolina, or in that case, the Florida Panthers, like it's again, they're just not matchups you should want, you know? So I'm not sold on the Washington Capitals, but I'm certainly not. I wouldn't be surprised if they made like at least it out of the first round. Like if they managed to get it together one last time and get to the second round, I wouldn't be surprised. But this might be the beginning of the end, right, for the Ovechkin era. Like this might be like the beginning of a lot of first round exits.
Well, I guess in one way you could say the continuation of a
Yeah.
trend that got momentarily upset in 2018. Uh, yeah, I mean the depth is good. I really do like the forward depth specifically, not the defense depth. I like the forward depth of this team. Guys like Garner Hathaway and uh, Connor Sheary and even Carl Hagelin, who's unfortunately hurt for them right now. I think guys like that and Nick Dowd and other players like that, they bring a lot of edge, they bring a lot of bite, they bring a lot of snarl, something that every playoff team needs, and they can also chip in pretty effectively. They've got size between guys like Ovechkin and Anthony Mantha, but there's just too many question marks that this isn't a team like the 2012 LA Kings, right? Where you look at it and you say, okay, sure, they're an 8th seed, but up and down the roster, there's not really any holes here. Maybe they just weren't built for the regular season. Or a team like, the Dallas Stars in the bubble, where you look at them and you're like, okay, sure, they're a 4th seed. They're not really all that threatening. I think that the Flames and the Avalanche are better teams, but there's not really a hole on this team, right? Where their position betrays how good they actually are. I think the Capitals are very much a team that is representative of the position they're in terms of being in a wild card. There's just too many question marks, too many holes. And a big question mark that has come up recently in our discussion specifically is the leadership of Alexander Ovechkin, where last year he was threatening a rookie starting goaltender in the playoffs after a playoff loss in which he made, what was it, like 48 saves or something like that. Like,
It's not a good look, yeah.
can Ovechkin keep a lid on this team enough and keep the leadership going enough in what is going to be very, very difficult circumstances for them. I don't know. It's also the first time we're going to see this Capitals team being led into the playoffs by Peter Laviolette, right? So it's going to be a question of how well has his system transferred over, and can he keep a handle on things, especially when your captain is threatening to basically murder your starting goaltender. There's a lot of things that are going against this team, and I'm thinking first round exit, but I think maybe against the, I can't even say I feel good about them against the Rangers. The only thing they have against the Rangers would be the experience part of it, but I don't know. I don't feel very good about this team in any of these matchups, so yeah. All right, so we have 3 teams in the West, so we'll just kind of go over these teams as well. We're going to talk about Minnesota, St. Louis, and Calgary. Minnesota comes in with a record of 48-21-7, 103 points, sitting at second in the Central Division. Looks like at this point, if they get just one more point, they will have locked that spot, a top 3 spot up, because the Predators are 10 points back with only 5 games to go. So if the Blues and the Wild get at least one more point, or the Predators don't get 2 points out of their last remaining 5 games, the top 3 spots in the Central will have been locked up. Man, how do I feel about the Wild? I feel like this is a question that comes up literally every time this team is even mentioned, and my answer is always I don't know. This team has some good players, but I don't know. It feels like really outside of Kirill Kaprizov, there's not a player on this team that really has that playoff kind of X factor. You know what I'm saying? It feels like a lot of
game breakers.
Right. And granted, look, people were saying the same thing about the Islanders 2 years ago, and last year in the playoffs, they don't have game breakers. So I get it. I'm not going to harp on that too much, but the Wild aren't the Islanders. They don't have Barry Trotz behind the bench. So there's that to take into consideration. It feels very much like those St. Louis Blues teams from the mid-2010s, doesn't it? Like, just a lot of really good players, maybe one game breaker, but there's nothing else here that really excites me. And I don't know. I mean, I think they're a great team, but can I say that they're a Stanley Cup contender? I don't
think you can, honestly.
Do you have any actual thoughts about this team? Because I'm at a loss really what to make out of them.
I mean, I feel like about this Wild team, like I do about all Minnesota Wild teams seemingly for the last 15 or so years, is that it's just a random mishmash of good players and okay players who don't necessarily have a discernible identity or play style, and more or less are just winning because they have a collection of decent players, you know? Because it doesn't when you think of the Minnesota Wild, you don't think wow, yeah, that's a fast skating team like Kirill Kaprizov. They come at you fast, they come at you hard, and they score a lot of goals. But you also don't think wow, it's a New York Islanders defensive stalwart. We're gonna go in there and they're gonna pound us in the corners, and they're gonna, really make it hard for us to get the puck to the net. You kind of think of them, you're just yeah, I guess they exist. I know they're good. They're winning games. And I mean, I don't know. I mean, Ryan Hartman's having a career year, right? He's playing way above water. And the trade for Marc-Andre Fleury, while I think it does help them now, definitely to me is not. I don't know. It doesn't feel like much of an upgrade. You know what I mean? It feels like a slight upgrade to a lateral move at worst. Kaapo Kähkönen sure isn't an elite goaltender by any stretch right now, but he's 25, and I'm pretty sure this was his second year in the NHL. So, I think it was kind of early for them to pull the trigger and give up on him and bring in a veteran goaltender. That being said, I think that's a signal from their general manager, who is not Doug Weight, but is the other American whose name I always forget.
Let's see. Bill Guerin.
Bill Guerin, that's it. And I think it's a signal from Bill Guerin that like they have to compete now, right? Like I don't know if he necessarily believes that this team is ready to compete for a Stanley Cup, but I think he believes that they have to because starting next year, guess what gets to be almost unbearable? Those buyout penalties for Zach Parise and Ryan Suter. I think they end up with like $14 million in dead cap next year.
Let's go.
So like, so I can see why there was like a real push to try to get whatever upgrades or seeming upgrades they could at the positions they needed them for this year. That being said, the unfortunate thing for the Minnesota Wild is I really don't think this is the year. I don't, I don't think there are any like terrible matchups for them. Like I don't think it's like the Pittsburgh Penguins where I'm looking at it going, like they can't win any of these. But I think they could beat a lot of the teams that they're around or matched up with. And like that being said, though, if they get out of the first round, I don't think they can get by a team like Colorado. Even if Colorado's a glass cannon, like I still think that they're just too good for Minnesota right now for where they are. So it's just kind of unfortunate it's unfortunate because Minnesota feels like it's stuck. Like they had a plan, they were rebuilding, and then in order to further that rebuild, they had to move on from Parise and Suter. But now it's forced them into this kind of weird position where like they are competitive right now, but it's now or never. And unfortunate for them, like it probably ended up being never,
Yeah, I mean next year, $12.7 million in buyout cap. The year after that, and the following year. So next year is 12.7, and then 2023 to 2025, those 2 years, $14.7 million in dead cap. After that, it's only 1.66, but like Jesus,
Yeah, but you just lost 3 years.
God, $14.5 million in dead cap is a killer. And yeah, I mean, when you look at this team, there are some things that I can point to and say, okay, look, they don't have an elite first line center. They don't have, they have some decent centers, like Nick Bukestad's not bad. Joel Eriksson Ek, I think, is a pretty solid second line center. I think he's one of the better second line two-way kind of centers in the NHL. But then you're looking at like Frederick Gaudreau and Tyson Jost, no real elite first line center. Eriksson Ek is more of a pest than a matchup type center, I think. He can certainly hang, but can he hang with like Nathan McKinnon? I don't know about that. So not really a matchup type center. Elite game breakers. You have Kaprizov and then not really anybody else. I think the defense is solid. I mean, Jody Benn, Jonas Brodin, Matt Dumba, Goligoski, Kulikov, Spurgeon, and then any of Middleton or John Merrill. I mean, that's a solid defense. And you have some elite players like Matt Dumba and Jordan Spurgeon or Jared Spurgeon. So I think the defense is perfectly fine. But then you look at it's just, and it's funny because we pretty much know at this point, barring some complete monumental collapse and miracle run by the Nashville Predators, a collapse by the Blues and a miracle run by the Predators, the Blues are going to be their first round matchup, right? Because the Colorado Avalanche have clinched the division, and if the Nashville Predators don't get 10 points out of their next 5 games, the Blues and Wild will be in second and third respectively. So we know that they're going to play the Blues. So I guess we can kind of tandem this conversation into the St. Louis Blues. And I'll go to you first on this one. How do you feel about the St. Louis Blues going into the playoffs this year?
So this is probably going to sound crazy, but for me, they're my favorite to come out of the Central Division right now. I think when you look at it, I mean, like the roster doesn't blow you off your skates, right? Like it's not going to knock your socks off, but it's a collection of like really solid role players combined with like some of the best two-way players in the league with guys like Ryan O'Reilly and I'm pretty sure David Perron's still in St. Louis.
Yes, he is.
And then you add in, Vladimir Tarasenko, who looks maybe not like his old self completely, but looks definitely to be of that same caliber again. Maybe his shooting isn't as good, but his ability to put up points is still there. So, and their defense is better than it's been. I mean, Torrey Krug definitely looks like he's finally settled in and is, living up to the contract that he signed. Like we thought he would. I mean, I had no doubt that Torrey Krug eventually would find his feet in St. Louis and fit in. I mean, I don't see why he wouldn't, That being said, the only question mark I have really with the St. Louis Blues, and it's the biggest one you probably could have with a team around this time of year, is their goaltending.
Yeah.
Ville Husso has been good recently. He's been pretty good for them down the stretch. He's been pretty good for them all year. Jordan Binnington, on the other hand, hasn't. He's been okay to start, and he's been mediocre to terrible pretty much the rest of the year. So bad, so much so that like Ville Husso has taken the job from him almost. So I'm not if I'm the St. Louis Blues, I'm not uber confident going to the playoffs with my goaltending. You know what I mean? Like it's either on one hand you have Jordan Binnington, who is a Stanley Cup winner, but hasn't played to that caliber in probably two seasons now, or you have Ville Husso, who's been pretty good for you, solid for you all year, but is untested. Like he doesn't have the experience, so you're in kind of a catch-22. But I mean, I don't think that's really going to pose much of a problem for them in the first round against Minnesota. I really think like because of how well built this team is defensively, like, and I mean just like as a whole team, not necessarily just like the defensive core, but like the whole team itself. They'll find it pretty easy, not easy, but they'll find it easier to bottle up Minnesota because they don't have, it's not Colorado. If we were saying like Colorado has to play St. Louis in the first round, I think I'd have a different conversation. I still think St. Louis could do it. It's just like it'd be a little tougher based on the fact that like Colorado's got more weapons at their disposal than Minnesota. So,
Yeah.
I mean, I would probably rank them in my bubble Stanley Cup contender tier, right? I think that St. Louis still has the pedigree, they still have the talent, and they still have mostly the roster to really make some noise and compete. And what is pretty much a pretty weak Western Conference. I mean, I don't know about you, but I'm not really feeling. If I were them, I wouldn't feel scared of pretty much any of those Pacific Division teams, really. And honestly, I really wouldn't be all that scared of any of the Central Division teams either. You know. That being said, I don't think they're as good as any of the Eastern Conference teams, but like just comparing them to like the rest of their own conference, I don't really see any matchups for the Blues that I'm like, yeah, that's pretty much a lock. Like they're done. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and I just want to make a quick point when we're talking about goaltenders who are untested. Somebody might bring up the argument, well, you guys are so sure and talking so much game about Igor Shesterkin and how he can single handedly carry the Rangers to a Stanley Cup, where you're talking about Ville Husso and Vanacek and Samsonov, who are of the similar age and similar caliber, or not similar caliber. I don't think anyone would make that argument, but similar age and similarly untested. I just want to bring up a quick point that the difference is that Igor Shesterkin, I'm pretty sure, was a champion of the KHL at least once, and if not, was one of the best goaltenders. It was either him or Sorokin every single year. He was one of the best goaltenders who made several deep playoff runs in one of the best competitive leagues in the entire world in the KHL. Whereas guys like Ville Husso have taken the route through a more traditional mean of playing against similarly calibered players in the minors, right? Ville Husso spent 2 years in the AHL. So
Right.
that's like the big difference is that sure, Sorokin and Shesterkin coming into the playoffs, like, Sorokin last year, Shesterkin this year, were untested in the NHL, but they had played several deep playoff runs against some of the best players in the world. Whereas, no offense to the AHL, AHL is a fantastic development league, don't get me wrong. It's not of the same ilk as the KHL. Just in terms
No.
of the kind of players that are playing there. It's and that's by design, right? It's a developmental league as opposed to a professional league.
Let's see. Sorry, I just wanted to. So to your point, yeah, like he played. I mean, does this give the playoff breakdown, or is this just the season? At any point in the regular season, he managed to win 24 of his 28 games in his last season in the KHL before coming to America. You know what I mean? Like he was playing against when, like you said, like an arguably the second best league in the world, and was winning consistently. Um, he's also played at a higher level internationally than a guy like Ville Husso has. You know what I mean? Like, he's played for Russia at the World Juniors. He's played for Russia at World Championships after the season. So, like, I think the reason we're not really, like, worrying about guys like Igor Shesterkin or even, like, last year, like, Ilya Sorokin, for that matter, was because they've proven that they can produce in a pressure cooker. Like, when the chips have been down for teams they've been on in other situations, they've shown up and played, you know? And we just can't say that about a guy like Billy Huso because we don't know. Like, I don't know what he's done in when the chips are down and he's had to win a game all by himself, more or less. I mean, like you said, he's had a pretty decent AHL career, but the AHL is not the NHL. And I guess you could make that argument about the KHL, but the KHL is probably closer in talent level to the NHL than the AHL is. And like you said, by design.
Right. So, yeah, I just wanted to get that argument kind of out there because I know that might come up at some point. But, yeah, I mean, go back to the St. Louis Blues. I agree with pretty much everything you said. I mean, the defense I think is fantastic. I mean, when you're rocking a defense of Robert Bortuzzo, Justin Falk, Torrey Krug, Nick Leddy, who's a big addition, Colton Parayko, and Marco Scandella, that's rock solid. I mean, you've got your offensive guys like Nick Leddy and Torrey Krug, defensive guys like Colton Parayko and Torrey Krug,
And Robert Bortuzzo, yeah.
They have one of arguably, if not the best two-way centers in the entire NHL in Ryan O'Reilly. And by the way, another fantastic two-way center in Braden Shen. So they have two essentially matchup type centers who can also score. Then you also have guys like Ivan Barbashev and Jordan Kyrou, Tyler Bozak up the middle who bring their own brands of different things to the table. Buchnevich has had a fantastic season for them. Tarasenko, like you said, is starting to look like the Tarasenko we knew. Robert Thomas continues to impress. Brendan Saad, David Perron. And then we look at the depth with guys like Logan Brown, Tyler Bozak. You've got a pretty complete roster. Remember, like I was saying, there are some teams that their position is not equivalent to their skill. I think that this is a complete roster outside of the goaltending. And I think one other point to bring up about the goaltending, this is not the same. This is not the same Jordan Binnington that won a Stanley Cup. In either his play on the ice, who he has an above 3 goals against average, he has a 3.14 and a 903 this year, and his mentality, right? The Jordan Binnington we saw win that Stanley Cup was like ice in the veins, calm, cool, collected. Game 7 in that first period, he made like 6 or 7 game-saving saves to keep the Bruins off the board, to give the Blues enough time to find their feet. He was just locked in, ready to go from the start. We've seen his mentality, I don't want to use the word deteriorate because that's a very aggressive word, but we've seen his mentality be very, very shaky, starting fights, throwing fits, trying to hit people, slash people. He's been pulled so many times this year and then tried to start a fight as a result. That's not the kind of mentality you want to have going into the playoffs. I'm not saying goaltenders can't be fiery. I mean, look at the best goaltender arguably of all time, Patrick Waugh, right? Probably one of the angriest guys on the ice constantly. Billy Smith, one of the angriest guys on the ice constantly. You can be angry, but you have to be angry and funnel that anger into results. Guys like Billy Smith got better when they got madder. Jordan Binnington is not that kind of player. He's significantly worse when he gets angry. So you either have this like questionably shaky mentality goaltender of Jordan Binnington, or you have Billy Huso, who is completely unproven. And I think that's going to be kind of like the Achilles heel. If anything's going to stop this team, it's going to be the goaltending. But I will say I'm going to put them the same as you, bubble Stanley Cup contender. The only thing stopping them from being a bona fide Stanley Cup contender is that defense. So we will see what happens. Although I do say, if you had to ask me today, and most likely will end up being on my bracket, I would pick the Blues to beat the Wild, and I'd feel pretty confident about doing that too.
I would as well.
So last team, I'll go to the Calgary Flames, 47, 20, and 10, 104 points, absolutely dominating at home, 23, 9, and 7. Man,
About time, right?
this team is one of these question marks too, and the big reason this team is a question mark is because their division is so bad. I mean, we've seen this happen before where teams come out of this a very weak, very, very, very weak division, and we're like, oh, this team's gonna kill it. They put up all these numbers and all these points, but then you look at who they're playing, and you're like, ooh, are they good though? Like, to put it into perspective, 4 of the bottom 5 teams in the West are Pacific Division teams. Or not 4. Sorry, I forgot the Coyotes are back in the Central Division. But the Seattle Kraken, San Jose Sharks, and Anaheim Ducks are all in the bottom 6. So 3 out of the bottom 5 teams are in the Pacific Division. So when I look at the roster, I mean, yeah, Johnny Gaudreau is having a fantastic season. Matthew Tkachuk's having a fantastic season. Elias Lindholm, Andrew Mangiapane. There's not like a super big red flag in a lot of places on this team, except for the depth. I'm not in love with the depth of this team. Like, you know, it's there, but I'm not excited about it. And then there's other kind of players who aren't quite doing what we thought they should be doing, most notably Sean Monahan, who only has 23 points in 65 games this year. Not really kind of living up to that second line kind of player that we thought he would be. Yeah, there's just some question marks depth-wise on this team, I think. But I will say that they are built pretty well for the playoffs. I mean, they've got, their grinders and their pests like Matthew Tkachuk and Milan Lucic, Dylan Dubé. Tyler Toffoli has been known to be a playoff producer. On the back end, you've got guys like Chris Tanev and Nikita Zadorov, big bruising bodies. I think that I'm pretty confident about this team being as good as they are in all places except the scoring depth. I think could use a little bit of help. Specifically, that third and fourth line could use a little bit of help. But I'm also not really willing to say they're a bona fide Stanley Cup contender, just quite honestly because I don't know how good they are with the division being as bad as it was. So I'm going to rank them as a bubble Stanley Cup contender, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts about this team.
So I'm going to start off by saying I'm going to rank them a playoff team with an asterisk. They could be a bubble Stanley Cup contender. They could be a bona fide Stanley Cup contender. I just have no idea because A, they play on the West Coast, so I don't see a lot of games, and B, their division is just so bad. Like, you're collecting so many easy points. It's like, all right, but how good are you really? But I do think it's about time that Calgary finally actually does something. You know what I mean? Like, how many years now have been saying, like, looking at the roster, like, well, this is a pretty complete roster. Like, these guys should go somewhere, and then it's like first round exit, don't make the playoffs. Like, and it's just like, okay, well, at least they're finally gonna make the playoffs. Like, and guys are actually like living up to their reputation, and specifically Johnny Gaudreau, who is finally looking like Johnny Hockey again instead of the lackluster performances he's put in. Yeah, the lackluster performances he's put in the last so many years. But I mean, I think the real strength they have for them right now is that Jacob Markstrom is an absolute animal. Like, he's proved all of the doubters wrong. Like, he went from Vancouver to Calgary and instantly turned this team into like a playoff team. You know what I mean? Like, he's essentially covering up a lot of the holes or like blemishes that this team has. I do think it's probably a worse version of the Calgary Flames than we've seen in years past, at least on paper. That being said, I don't see any team in that Pacific Division that's really going to stop them.
No.
Like, I don't feel good about the Edmonton Oilers. We'll get into them more after they clinch, if they clinch. They probably will clinch. But, I don't feel great about the Oilers. I don't even know. I think LA is still in a playoff position in the Pacific
LA is
somewhere.
currently in third. The next closest teams to a playoff team in the Pacific is the Vegas Golden Knights, who currently sit 4 points out of the second wildcard spot. So right now it's Calgary, Edmonton, and LA.
Yeah, so I mean, the LA Kings are kind of a joke. Like, not to be mean, but like it's a team that's rebuilding that's really only in the playoffs this year because Vegas couldn't get their shit together. Like, cause let's be honest, like in that number 2 and number 3 spot, it should have been the Vegas Golden Knights
Yeah.
or number 1. Honestly, like they probably should have won this division easily. But anyway, that's a different story for a different day. That's our like 30 and 30 documentary for this off season. Vegas Golden Knights, what went wrong? Um, yeah, I don't know. Like, but I don't think they're strong enough to take on some of those Central Division teams. Like, I think they're way too one-dimensional, way too easy to bottle up to be able to take on St. Louis. Like, St. Louis will find a way to bottle up their top scorers, and it'll be over. Because, like you said, their depth scoring isn't there. You know, Calgary up against Colorado, they might have a shot just because, like we keep saying, Colorado's a big glass cannon, but, like, that's a big glass cannon. Like, I don't know if they'll be able to hold McKinnon and Rantanen and Kadri and guys like that off the board enough to be able to beat them. You know, the only
Yeah.
team I think that they could beat if they came out of the Central, which I at this point we already agreed like we don't think it's going to happen, is Minnesota, and that's the only team I really look at for Calgary that I'm like, yeah, this is an easy layup for them out of the Central. Otherwise, kind of iffy. So I'm just gonna put them as a playoff team with an asterisk because who the hell knows? They really could be like an actual like disgusting team, and we just have no idea because like they've just been beating up on Anaheim and Seattle all year.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at the roster and you ignore the circumstances in which they were playing, I do think that the roster does offer a lot. Defense is solid. Top six is solid. I would like a little bit more depth scoring wise, but they still have the pests. They have those, as you would like to say, meat and potatoes hockey players. The goaltending
Yeah,
between Markstrom and Vladar is fantastic. But again, we've seen this roster look good and then lay complete eggs in the playoffs. So it's kind of like
more or
those
less.
those
Yeah.
like middle 2010 St. Louis Blues teams where we're like, they look good on paper, it's looking good, but they keep laying eggs. So am I really gonna believe in them this year? I'll give them a shot this year. Ah, shit, they lost to Chicago again. Like.
More or less, yeah. Or those Anaheim Ducks teams from the same era where it's like they look really good. I think they can finally beat LA. Oh shit, they lost LA again. So it's like, and I mean Calgary's kind of in the same boat, right? Like they just keep losing to. I mean, last year in the Canadian division,
Didn't even make
look,
the playoffs, like,
yeah, that's
which
really the thing
they
too,
should have
right?
ran that
Like,
division.
well, bro, they should have won. Yeah, they should have easily won that division. So like, that's what I'm saying. Like, even in a weak division last year, they couldn't get their shit together enough to get into the playoffs. Like, so the fact that they did it this year and arguably just as weak of a division is like, what? Wait, what are you guys doing? Like, what is happening in Calgary?
Yeah, I will go on a record and lay this at my own feet so it can come back and bite me in the ass. On paper, I think this is a really good team. It's just, is it going to happen?
Is it finally gonna happen? Yeah.
So that'll wrap up our playoff teams. We're still waiting for a couple teams in the West: Edmonton, LA, and then the two wildcard spots. Currently in the two wildcard spots is Nashville and Dallas. Vegas and Vancouver still gunning for those last two wildcard spots. Only 4 points back with 5 games to go for each of those teams. So it'll be interesting to see what happens there. So when those teams start to wrap up and clinch, we will discuss those teams as well. So before we end off, just wanted to kind of note a monumental passing, unfortunately, in the National Hockey League of Mike Bossy, New York Islanders legend, who passed away after a battle with, I believe it was lung cancer. You know, a lot has been said about Mike Bossy. A lot of stuff, that I don't think we really need to repeat in terms of just how great he was and all that. For my money, the best pure goal scorer the NHL has ever seen. I'm biased. I totally own that.
No,
But
I agree. I'm totally in the same boat. He's I mean, the numbers speak for themselves. Like you said, like what do we have to say about a guy who scored almost 600 goals in only 500 games? You know,
Yeah.
like the guy played. I mean, the guy was just money. He scored 50 goals his rookie year and never looked back.
I think it was what
And
he only didn't score 50 goals his last season when that back injury
yeah,
finally caught up to him.
yep. And I think even still then he scored 30 goals. So it's like, it's a shame to think like Mike Bossy is also one of the greatest like what if stories in sports, Like what if his back didn't get hurt? What if he didn't have to retire early? Like would he have scored 1,000 goals? At the end of the day, like I think all that doesn't really matter. It's just like for my money, he would have been number one on that leaderboard if he didn't have to retire.
Yeah.
Like easily the greatest goal scorer of all time. Like you can make your argument for Alex Ovechkin all you want, but if you look at the games played, Alex Ovechkin has like nearly double the games that Mike Bossy has, and only has maybe what 200 or 300 more goals. And it's like you got double the games on the guy, and you could only put up a couple hundred more goals than he could. Granted, Mike Bossy played in an era that's known for its high scoring and its open nature of its game, but that's not to take anything away from the guy. In an era of high scoring, the guy still scored 60, 70 goals regularly. Like that, you don't, that's not like a fluke. Once, yeah. Twice, maybe. But he did it like every year.
Yeah. Just one of the those kind of players that you would go to the game just to watch, and it's for to stand out as much as he did on a team that was as star-studded as those dynasty teams were, really tells you just what kind of a player he was. And then off the ice, the stories we hear about him and being such a family man. I think it was Trottier was talking about that, about just how much of a family man Mike Bossy was, and then how much he missed his family and made sure to visit them as often as possible, and all the things that he did, for the New York Islanders organization after his retirement. Just, a fantastic player. Like we said, for our money, the best pure goal scorer of all time. A great man by many accounts. And if you when you listen to him talk, whenever you watch those interviews, and I do highly recommend watching Mike Bossy interviews. He's such an interesting mind too. He said it in his top 100 players of all time interview. He said, "Yeah, I probably could have played another 4 or 5 seasons, but I didn't want to play hockey when I wasn't my best, so I retired." And it's like, what a fantastically like interesting statement to just be like, well, I could have played longer, but like I wasn't 100%. Even if I was only like 90%, he's like, I'm done. You know, uh,
I mean, it's also something to be respected about a guy who's willing to know when to call it quits, when to say like, be able to say like, you know what, I could half-ass this maybe for the rest of my like another 4 or 5 years and collect some money, but like, what good is that? Like, you got to respect a guy who is willing to say, I will only give you my best, to the organization, to his fans, to his teammates. He's like, I'm only going to give you guys my best, and if I can't do that, I'm not even going to play.
right.
And like, because a lot of guys wouldn't, not to throw like certain guys under the bus or whatever, but like there are players who would just say, well, I'm not at my best, but like I can still play, so I can still get paid, like, and whether the money is the driving factor, the fact that they just don't know when to call it quits is kind of irrelevant. It's just the fact that like knowing when to go out on top, you know, like Mike Bossy is like Wayne Gretzky in a lot of ways too, right? Like Wayne Gretzky is in the same echelon of player as Mike Bossy for me, and like they're both the greatest at what they did in their eras, and both of them knew that like, you know what, I could probably play another couple of years, but like, why am I going to be a shadow of my former self? Like, why am I going to embarrass myself? You know, and whether or not they really looked at it as embarrassing themselves, like, is neither here nor there. It's just more or less like, why am I going to give you less than my best every night? Like, there's no point. You don't deserve that.
Yeah, certainly. It's a very respectable thing to do. And I think honestly that might end up being a whole podcast in and of itself someday between us, just talking about guys having to know when to retire. But yeah, just an unfortunate event in a series of very unfortunate incidents between New York Islanders this year. So, just between losing Eugene Potvin and Clark Gillies and now Mike Bossy, just it's been a rough
A
year
rough
for
year on the island, yeah.
those teams. So, from both of us, we want to extend our condolences to Mike Bossy's family, his friends, his loved ones. And for me, I'll give you a chance to speak at the end as well, Steve. But for me, I just want to say thank you, to Mike Bossy. I wasn't around when he was playing. I unfortunately never got the pleasure of watching Mike Bossy play live. But I can't say with certainty that my team would be here if not for a player like Mike Bossy. If the Islanders never got out of that rut and stayed a bad team throughout the entire 70s
and 80s,
and
yeah.
80s, who knows? So the fact that I have a team who has a state-of-the-art arena that I can go and watch, every night if I really wanted to, I owe pretty much, and the fact that I have a podcast where I'm talking about hockey with my best friend, it's obviously not just on the shoulders of Mike Bossy. It's on the shoulders of many, many people from top to bottom in the Islanders organization. But Mike Bossy was a huge, huge part of that, and so was Clark Gillies as well. So I just want to say thank you, to both those guys for doing what they did and letting me, be a fan of this team and bleed blue and orange. So I don't know if you have any final thoughts. I'll let you kind of.
I mean, yeah, I'm obviously in the same boat, right? We're the same age. Like, I didn't get to see Mike Bossy play either, but I mean, I was talking to my dad, obviously, who was there, who grew up in that era, watched the Islanders win all those cups again. All, Ranger fan too, but like you still hearing it from him how much he respected Mike Bossy was like really important for me. I think when I really started to become a fan of the sport, like it was a big moment for me to be able to differentiate like fans, like fandom, and like actual respect for like the game and the players who play it. You know what I mean? Like if Mike Bossy were playing today and he was wearing an Islander jersey and I went to the game, I'd be like, "Fuck you, Bossy," blah blah blah, right? But like at the end of the day, like when push came to shove, like I would shake his hand on the street. Like that's a guy like you. They talk about standing on the shoulders of giants, and like you said, there's a lot of names to that list of Islanders who helped build the franchise, but like he is the giant whose shoulders they're standing on, or one of them. You know what I mean? Like when you think of that core of that dynasty team, it's like him, Potvin, Gillies, Billy Smith, and Brian Trottier. Like those are the five like real giants that the Islanders' legacy and history is like built on. And without Mike Bossy, that doesn't happen. Realistically, like I don't think without him that those Islander teams win those 4 Stanley Cups. They might win one, they may win 2, but I don't think they win the 4. Or even make the drive for the 5th one. So I think, yeah, I guess it's really just like I wanted to extend like my condolences again to like his friends and family, and to really just hammer home the fact that like despite his being on the opposition, when the battle lines were drawn and we were on the ice, like he's a guy I've always respected immensely and has always been a great ambassador for the game, has always been really outgoing and, great with fans. You used to see him at all those Islander fan events. He'd come out and he'd always be smiling, taking pictures of people. Like never was there a more gracious ambassador for what it meant to be a New York Islander.
Yeah, certainly. So we'll leave it on those grateful notes from Steve and I. So next week, again, as more teams clinch, we will be discussing that. And certainly at some point when the West is settled, if the Vegas Golden Knights are not there, that might be a whole freaking podcast in and of its own. So,
like I said, bro, it's our 30 and 30 documentary for the off season.
So stay tuned because interesting things are certainly happening in the National Hockey League. So we want to thank you guys for listening, and we will see you guys again next time.